All right, welcome to Unit 11, World War II. This is definitely one of my favorites. You're looking at a P-40 Warhawk. This is one of the main airplanes used by the United States at the beginning of World War II. Because of our economic prowess, we create much more powerful airplanes later in the war, in particular the P-51, among others. But we are flying towards Pearl Harbor. So this is obviously part of Hawaii, and what you're looking at there in the middle, under the wings of the plane, right there, that is called Ford Island. And around that island was what's called Battleship Row. So surrounding the island, this is where all the battleships were basically moored or chained up. Now this was a huge mistake on our part because you never want to have all your ships in one place, but we were not really expecting an attack at Pearl Harbor. Well, one guy was, but we'll talk about that later. But anyway, if you look at the right wingtip below there, sitting below that would be the USS Missouri, and then just passing the wingtip, that is the USS Arizona Memorial, which we'll take a better look at that in a moment. But the battleship Missouri, that is where the war ended. The Japanese signed the treaty to end the war on the deck of that ship. The battleship Arizona was sunk during Pearl Harbor, and that's where the World War II, at least for America, that's where it began. Now, we held out and did not join the war right away because, again, we're isolationists, as you've seen in previous units, and we don't want to get involved. So it took this attack here at Pearl Harbor to make us join the war and show how much power economically that we have to build weapons faster than they can be destroyed. So why did the Japanese attack us? Well, the Japanese had been doing some really diabolical things to China and other countries near them. And this is often called the Rape of Nanking, and that's a whole nother subject. You won't be responsible for that, but literally the Japanese are taking over China and doing all kinds of craziness. We did not like that. We understood that they were, doing some things they shouldn't be doing, so we cut off their oil and steel. Now, at this point, we are one of the biggest oil producers in the world, being the United States, as well as steel, and these are things you need for war. So the Japanese decided the only thing they could do was attack us, and they underestimated the United States. They felt like we would give up and we wouldn't have the desire to fight. So you can see here, I am approaching the Arizona Memorial. Now, I'll insert some pictures so you can see a little bit clearer, because this is an obviously flight simulator. But the battleship Arizona is right below the surface, and that is a tomb for about 2,000 people. So this is sacred ground. Okay, so before we get into the meat of the notes, I wanted to point out some vocabulary that's important. So the United States is literally fighting two separate wars. There's the European theater. This is where Germany and Italy are the Axis nations, and we are helping England and France and the Soviet Union eventually, because they start the war with Germany. All the fighting's taking place in Europe, but then we're kind of alone, not totally, but we're doing the bulk of the work in the Pacific, where we're fighting against Japan. The fighting takes place across the Pacific Ocean, mostly sea battles and on island chains. So the Pacific theater is a completely different type of war compared to the European theater. So for my students, I really do a lengthy introduction to World War II explaining how Hitler rose to power. But since this is mostly for remediation, we don't really have time for that because you're not going to be tested on that. So we're going to just get right to it. Hitler rises to power, and what starts World War II, from most people's opinions, is when Hitler invades Poland. He had previously basically taken over Austria and then he did the same with Czechoslovakia. But because Poland has a treaty with England and France, this is what begins the war in Europe. The Soviet Union begins the war on Germany's side, but that doesn't last too long. Hitler doesn't look too fondly at the Soviet Union because they're predominantly Jews, especially in the Eastern European part. So when the Soviet Union also invades Poland, it kind of rubs Hitler the wrong way. So while this war is going on, the United States stays neutral. Germany has overran France. Most of Europe has been taken over very quickly by a new type of warfare called blitzkrieg, and highly movable tanks, very quick. They're not doing the typical type of battle tactics that would have taken place in the past. But in mid-1941, Hitler turned on the Soviet Union. Now this creates a problem for him because now he's fighting a war on the Western Front and the Eastern Front. But the United States is helping Britain. We have the Lend-Lease Act, which we'll talk about, where the president is giving them weapons, food, other things, not just Britain, but all of the countries on the Allied side. Literally, Americans don't want to risk American lives to go to war, so literally we're just giving them as much aid as possible. But once Pearl Harbor is attacked, then everyone is gung-ho for war. You have massive numbers of young Americans signing up to join the military, plus we have a draft. But statistics that I've seen show that the United States before Pearl Harbor had roughly about 140,000 troops. A year later, we were up to 14 million. So during the 1930s, as I mentioned before, Japan is invading Manchuria and China. They're committing all types of atrocities. We understood what was happening, and we actually helped them, but indirectly. We have a large number of military personnel that give up their commissions and they join a voluntary force. A good example of that is the Flying Tigers, a group of pilots that go over and help. And Russia does the same. Ultimately, because Japan is concerned that we have taken away their oil and steel, so they plan a sneak attack on December 7th, 1941, where they bomb Pearl Harbor. Again, about 3,000 Americans died on that day, and after that point, Roosevelt gives a speech. He calls it a date that will live in infamy, and he asks Congress to declare war on Japan. After Pearl Harbor, Hitler honored a pact with Japan, and he declared war on the United States. So it's, by most people's account, truly a world war at this point. Okay, so this graphic can help you understand who the key political leaders are of the European theater. So my big thing is, when you're taking a test, remember economic, social, and political. When they're asking you questions that use those terms, think about the definition. So political leaders are leaders of the government, because we're also going to be talking about the military leaders, and that's what confuses people. So if you focus on who are the political leaders, you can ask yourself, oh, FDR, he's a president. Harry Truman, he's a president. So they're American political leaders. Winston Churchill is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Joseph Stalin is the dictator of the Soviet Union, and obviously Hitler is the Führer, or the dictator, for Nazi Germany. So this is where some people get confused with testing. For the United States and the European theater, our military leaders are Dwight D. Eisenhower and George C. Patton. So again, FDR and Harry Truman, they're the political leaders, the President of the United States. FDR dies in office, and Harry Truman, who's the Vice President, takes over. But the military leaders in the European theater are Dwight D. Eisenhower and Patton. And to note, Eisenhower is the supreme commander of all the Allied forces, and he later becomes president during the Cold War era. So additionally, we also have two different strategies. The Allied strategy in Europe is to defeat Hitler first. While Japan has directly attacked the United States and Germany has not, we understood that Germany was a little bit more of a threat. Many American resources, actually most of them, are targeted for Europe first. The Axis strategy is pretty straightforward in the European theater. Germany hoped to defeat the Soviet Union quickly by gaining control of the Soviet oil fields, and then to force Britain out of the war through a bombing campaign called the Battle of Britain. Additionally, submarine warfare was one of Germany's strengths, even going back to World War I, but Hitler himself even knew that America entering the war was not good for him because of our economic strength, the industries that we have in the United States in terms of building weapons of war. So in the major battles category, we have the Battle of Stalingrad. So this is the one battle that we're not focusing on. Remember, this is U.S. history. Germany is fighting the Soviet Union. Now, ultimately, the Soviet Union wins, not because they're necessarily the better army. They have so many people, but they're not very well prepared. They don't have the best equipment. They have not much of an air force, etc. But Hitler makes a huge mistake. He invades, and the Germans are not prepared for the winter. So a lot of people kind of joke about the fact that Hitler was defeated by winter, not necessarily by the Soviets. But after this defeat, the Soviets turn it around and start pushing back towards Germany. Now, the big one here is the Normandy landings, or D-Day, Operation Overlord. This is the invasion of France by the Allies to begin liberating Western Europe. So again, if you've seen the beginning to Saving Private Ryan, you're seeing a very accurate reproduction of what D-Day would have been like. And the last battle in the European theater that you need to be aware of is the Battle of the Bulge. This is the last German offensive of the war on the Western Front. Now, personally, I would really focus on the Normandy landings and D-Day. That's pretty much guaranteed to be the type of question you're going to see information about on any type of CSAs and SOLs because it's such a big deal. So next up, we have the key leaders of the Pacific Theater. So Douglas MacArthur is the key military leader for the United States in the Pacific. And over for Japan, you have Emperor Hirohito, or Emperor Showa. He is, again, their emperor, but some people would say he really wasn't pulling a lot of the strings, but you just need to know his name. And then we have Hideki Tojo. Again, he's the military leader, but again, you just need to be able to recognize his name that he's for Japan. So the strategy for the United States in the Pacific is a little bit different. It's called island hopping. The idea here is that we have to have a place that we can land our airplanes and launch our airplanes to attack Japan. We can't put our aircraft carriers at risk by just, sailing across the ocean. It's so vast. So what we do is the first major battle that takes place is the Battle of Midway, which we'll talk about shortly. But the Battle of Midway is important because if we had lost that battle, the Japanese would be closer to island hopping towards America, their next step being Hawaii, and then to the continental United States itself. So again, the whole basis is we have to keep making small steps, getting closer and closer to Japan, as you can see from the map, until finally we're close enough to launch bombers to attack them. Japan's strategy is pretty straightforward. After Pearl Harbor, they invaded the Philippines and Indonesia, and they planned to invade both Australia and Hawaii. Japan's leaders hoped that America would accept Japanese predominance in Southeast Asia and the Pacific rather than conduct a bloody and costly war. So ultimately, the Japanese thought that Americans were kind of lazy and that we would just give up, and that just didn't happen. It was kind of the opposite. So in the Pacific, the major battles are Midway, which I'm going to show you a little bit of a clip from Call of Duty Vanguard. So Midway, Japan attacks the Midway Islands, and again, as I explained, if they were to win, they would be closer to hitting the continental United States. Iwo Jima is part of the island hopping campaign to progressively get closer to Japan to prepare for an invasion, and Okinawa is the last major battle, brutal fighting as the United States troops are very close to Japan. So now you're watching a video clip. It's kind of a mishmash. I played a mission, but it was about 16 minutes long, so it was too much to fit in. But it's the mission basically of the attack at Midway, where we're using dive bombers to blow up the Japanese aircraft carriers. But I'm going to take this opportunity to just really quickly point out a man named Edwin Layton. And he's not in the curriculum, but probably should be. He is a guy who was in intelligence, meaning he's part of the group of people trying to break the codes of the Japanese. He spoke Japanese. He had personally met Admiral Yamamoto before the war. So he was aware that the Japanese possibly would attack Pearl Harbor, but he didn't specifically point that out, and he felt guilty about it. But he was able to predict the attack at Midway down to the exact date and the direction they would come from. So if you've ever had the opportunity to watch the more recent movie Midway, there's an older one too, But the more recent movie is very, very good, and it tells his story as well as the story of quite a few other people. So Leighton played a huge role in our victory over the Japanese in the Pacific, and he's someone who's often forgotten in terms of school curriculum, etc. But that tends to be the case in a lot of circumstances. You'll hear me quote unquote complain about the curriculum sometimes. It's not really a complaint, it's just there's so many interesting things that are not brought up that students would really enjoy, and it's just not in the curriculum. Okay, and finally we have the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the whole Manhattan Project, the creation of the atomic bomb, isn't really included in the curriculum. That's a shame because it's really interesting. However, the atomic bomb ended the war, and it brings in a whole new era because this is kind of the gateway getting into the Cold War. But again, the people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were just obliterated. The cities were vaporized. It's really intense. And again, for my students, I generally show them a lot of the pictures of the survivors, the injuries, and things like that. It's not very pleasant. But again, something you might want to look into separately, but that's not something you're going to necessarily be tested on. So, unfortunately for African Americans, they were not totally treated equally. They generally served in segregated military units, similar to what we talked about in terms of the Spanish-American War and World War I. So there hadn't been a lot of progress since then. Most of the African Americans were assigned to non-combat roles, but they wanted the right to serve in combat rather than support roles. One instance where that was the case is the Tuskegee Airmen. These are African American pilots, and this was an experiment to see if African Americans could do one of the toughest jobs in the war, and they were highly successful. Another segregated unit is called the Nisei Regiments. These are Japanese Americans who earned a high number of decorations. Another thing is we have the Navajo. These are American Indians or Native Americans. They were using their language, which was not written down. It's an oral language, and the Japanese could not break the code. So when you had two Navajos speaking to each other via radio, the Japanese could not determine what was being said. And finally, we have Hispanic Americans served, but they served in non-segregated units. So once again, economics is generally not that exciting. However, the United States government and industry forged a close working relationship to allocate resources effectively. War bonds and income tax were used to finance the war. Rationing was used to maintain a supply of essential products to the war effort. And businesses retooled from peacetime to wartime production. For example, one of the more famous examples, Ford, who makes automobiles, they started manufacturing tanks. So human resources, more women and minorities entered the labor force. Citizens also volunteered in support of the war effort. So this was a huge opportunity for women and minorities because, again, if there's a factory that needs workers, people aren't going to be as particular because there's a shortage of the men who are fighting in the war and dying. So for military resources, the draft is the primary tool of getting personnel. This is also called the selective service. Today, when you get your driver's license, you're registered for that if you're a male. So females do not register for selective service at this point. But again, in the past, you had to fill out a card and you would go to the post office to fill that out when you turned 18. Next up, we have women on the home front during World War II. Women increasingly participated in the workforce to replace men serving in the military. For example, Rosie the Riveter, as you can see from the graphic. Additionally, women typically participated in non-combat military roles, for example, medical, nurses, etc. So African Americans on the home front in World War II. African Americans migrated to cities in search of jobs in war plants, so places where they're building, weapons of war, tanks, etc., airplanes. African Americans campaigned for victory in war and equality at home. This is called the Double V campaign. So again, they're trying to end racism. Many of them felt slighted that they were not able to serve in combat roles. Okay, this is an interesting piece of information here. We have media communications assistance. The United States government maintained strict censorship of reporting of the war. Now, that's kind of a violation of the First Amendment. But again, the way they approached it was they basically hit on people's patriotism. Everybody's afraid that, both Nazis are using slave labor and the Japanese as well. So the posters that you're looking at the bottom, this is portraying the enemy in stereotypical ways, and it's something that probably wouldn't fly today. Public morale and ad campaigns kept Americans focused on the war. Sometimes you would see propaganda pieces before movies, things like that. So they're trying to boost patriotism in order to keep everyone focused on winning the war. And one of the darker themes of the war, to be fair, the whole war is pretty sad to be honest, but we have the Holocaust. The Nazis targeted specific groups for genocide to create a master race. Germany's decision to exterminate the Jewish population through genocide is called the final solution. Additional groups including Poles, Slavs, Gypsies, homosexuals, the mentally ill, and the physically handicapped were also targeted. A lot of people don't realize that the Holocaust is not just against the Jews, but there were other people as well. In fact, the first start of the Holocaust was German children with disabilities. So you can see some of the pictures down at the bottom. Very sad stuff. Auschwitz is one of the main extermination camps that can be visited still today, which is pretty sad. So after the war is over, they have the Nuremberg trials. And the big thing here is many of the German soldiers and other Nazis, they basically said, hey, we were just following orders, but it didn't matter. They were committed based on their participation. So this is a really serious thing. Many of the Nazis were hung. And that being said, I want to point out, not everyone was a Nazi, and I'm not going into hey, there were good Germans and bad Germans. I'm not doing that. But what I'm trying to make sure that you understand, the Nazis are a political party, and some people joined and some didn't. But again, soldiers made choices, and that's always going to be the case. But just so you understand, Germany only had one political party after Hitler took over. And that's, again, it's a long story explaining his rise to power, but it's very interesting, and I would suggest that, if you are interested, look into it. It's very enlightening. So prisoners of war were drastically treated differently depending on if they were in the European theater or the Pacific theater. So first you have to understand there's what's called the Geneva Convention. After World War I, it established rules of war concerning the humane treatment of prisoners. So in the European theater, the treatment was more along the lines of the Geneva Convention. But in the Pacific theater, there was terrible savagery. And what they compare it to is the Bataan Death March, which is something that the Japanese did to not only Filipinos, but Americans and even some British soldiers. So again, there were atrocities committed on both sides in the Pacific theater because of just how bad it was. But the European theater, it's not that things didn't happen, but it was at least closer related to the Geneva Convention. From my understanding, one of the reasons that the Nazis did not mistreat Americans is because they understood that the Americans were not mistreating their prisoners of war. However, when you do look at the way that the Russians or Soviets and the Nazis treated each other, they were both treating each other brutally, committing atrocities, etc. Okay, and last we have the treatment of Japanese American civilians. This is kind of one of the more disturbing things in terms of from the American side. Japanese Americans. Now, we're not talking about Japanese people. We're talking about Americans of Japanese ancestry. They were not trusted. They were moved to what's called internment camps because of the strong anti-Japanese prejudice, especially on the West Coast. Now, you can see pictures of the notices that went out, and you can see a picture of one of the many internment camps that are out there. The Supreme Court even upheld the government's right to act against Japanese Americans living on the West Coast of the United States. So in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was signed to kind of apologize for what happened. That's kind of a little bit not enough. I think they were given a symbolic payment of $20,000. But many of these people owned land in California, and that is worth so much more today. So it's really just not cool how people were treated. But remember, these are Japanese Americans. They're not Japanese people in terms of Japanese citizens. They're American citizens of Japanese ancestry.